Evil flourishes when good men do nothing.
Criminals went free.
What are you all wasting my time for? I'll be out tomorrow.
Officials were bribed.
There are rumors that the pardons can be bought.
Witnesses were threatened. The FBI couldn't stop it.
They're talking about dropping the investigation.
But one woman had the courage to try.
You are a troublemaker.
That is a lie.
Larkin Bibbs, second-degree.
You're listening to the trailer for the 1985 movie Marie, about a Nashville woman who blew the whistle on corruption in the highest levels of state government. As the tagline for the movie notes, it's a true story, one in which another Nashvilleian played a role.
One day she called me at the office, says, "Can you meet with me?" And you know me, I'm all, yeah, sure. And I met with her at Deep Wells picnic grounds at Percy Warner Park. And she's telling me this story, how some members of the state parole board were selling paroles.
Former reporter Larry Brinton died recently, so in this special podcast, we'll not only take a look at his involvement in exposing Tennessee's notorious Cash-for-Clemency scandal, we'll also hear Larry talk about his early life in Nashville, his career in journalism, and some of the other stories he covered, such as President Kennedy's 1963 visit and the 1996 murder of Janet March. All of that and a lot more on this episode of Nashville Retrospect. Welcome to the Nashville Retrospect podcast. I'm your host, Allen Forkum. I am also the editor and publisher of the Nashville Retrospect, a monthly newspaper full of old news stories from and new essays about Nashville's past. Our August 2019 issue is already on newsstands. In it, you'll find a 1975 article about the death of famed Grand Ole Opry performer Cousin Jody, whose real name was James Clell Summey. In 1899, a number of Nashville families were made sick by contaminated buttermilk. The milk did not come from a dairy, but from a South Nashville woman who had a couple of cows and who also became ill. In 1869, the last of the state militia in Middle Tennessee was mustered out. They'd been stationed here to quell Ku Klux Klan violence, which returned soon after they left. And in 1926, at the Tennessee State Prison in Nashville, a Memphis man known as the petting Party Bandit was put to death in the electric chair. He denied committing the Lover's Lane murder for which he was convicted. You can also read about the beanies Vandy freshmen were forced to wear in bygone times, about the Cascade Plunge swimming pool at the fairgrounds, about the Nashville Vols home run champion Bob Lennon, and about Elijah Robertson, brother of Nashville founder James Robertson, who helped defend early settlers from attacks by Indians intent on driving them away. To see article excerpts and photographs from some of these and other stories, visit our Facebook page. You can pick up the latest issue of the Retrospect for only $2 at local grocery stores and markets. And at NashvilleRetrospect.com, you can order subscriptions and even back issues. And don't forget, we need advertising sponsors, both for this podcast and for the newspaper. If you or someone you know want to reach fans of Nashville and its history, contact us. You'll find our phone number and email address on our webpage. Your support helps us keep Nashville history alive at a time when our rapidly changing city needs it most. Larry Brinton died last week on July 25, 2019, at the age of 88. He was known in Nashville for his hard-nosed investigative reporting. He spent years as a writer and editor at the Nashville Banner and later worked as a journalist for local television. A notice of his death on our Facebook page received numerous positive comments. He was a true newsman, wrote Paula Underwood Winters, whose father worked with Larry. Mary Powell wrote, "If the story was by Larry, it was timely, well-documented, factual, and a true reflection of the journalism profession." Claudia Johnson wrote that Larry inspired those of us who went to journalism school. In his retirement, Larry noticed that we were publishing his old banner articles in the Nashville Retrospect. In fact, he called to let me know that he enjoyed seeing them. Soon after, he sent me, unsolicited, a new article, complete with the mugshot of a prison escapee. Over the next 8 years, Larry wrote over 90 articles for the Retrospect, most of them about crime stories he covered decades ago. I decided to start this podcast last year, so as you might imagine, Larry Brinton was the first person I wanted to interview. We met in his Nashville home on March 24th, 2018, the day after he and his wife, Rita, had survived a small kitchen fire. Larry wanted to go ahead with the interview nonetheless. I talked with him at a small desk in his living room, which is next to another room, with walls covered in awards, photographs, and newspaper clippings. I used part of that interview in episode 1, which I highly recommend, as Larry covers some of his most famous stories, such as the Marcia Trimble murder and the string bean killings. But I didn't use the entire interview. Larry also discussed his early life in Nashville, growing up around Hillsboro Village, and the beginning of his career in journalism.
I grew up mostly in Hillsboro Village. I lived a few years on Natchez Trace, but my family moved to Hillsboro Village, and I went to Aiken Elementary School. After that, we moved over near Belmont College, and I had to change over to Waverly Belmont. From there, I went to West High School. My father died when I was a sophomore. That made some changes. I had to do a lot of work afterwards because we didn't grow up on Belmead Boulevard. And so I worked in Hillsboro Village, drugstores, service stations. I carried papers. I worked at a place called the Sweet Shop. I just did all of that. I can almost tell you every business that was down there back in those early days. The pet shop, Jones's Pet Shop, is still there, I think. I worked at a drugstore named Melton's Pharmacy. Let's see, there was a H.G. Hill store, McGavock's television, radios at Woolworths. Had the old Belmont Theater. I worked there.
You worked at the Belmont?
Oh, yeah. You had to, when your father dies and you don't really have any income, and my mother worked for the state. We just didn't have any money. So, I worked at a lot of places.
Do you remember the Bell Court, ever going there, the theater? Bell Court?
Yeah. Yeah, sure. It was, back then, it was the Children's Theater. That was the name of it. And it's the same place, it's the exact same place. They had all these children's shows and stuff. They didn't have adult shows. The Grand Ole Opry played out there a few times. I don't know why, but they were there. And I went to while the Grand Ole Opry was there, I went there once or twice. I remember one time the Ringing Brothers, Barnum Bailey, brought their big tent to Centennial Park. And they had a show, and the next day, after the first night's show, I was always looking to make some money. I went out and picked up bottles inside the tent. And was in return, I got 2 tickets. And when I got through, I headed home, and I was so tired, I gave my tickets away to Bobby Melton, who was Melton's pharmacist's son. He went to it didn't matter to me. I worked so much, I enjoyed it. After I graduated from West, I didn't have the money to go to college. All my friends went to Peabody College, but I couldn't. Instead, I went into the United States Navy, and that was a godsend for me. That was I recommend anybody to do that that doesn't have something planned for their early years. But I went to the Navy, served aboard 2 ships, traveled through the Mediterranean, and just really enjoyed it. It was very good for me.
And that was the Korean War, correct?
The Korean War, yeah, during the Korean War. I thought I was headed for Korea. I went to basic training in San Diego thinking I'd be going to Korea. As it turned out, the ship I was on is a destroyer. We went through the Panama Canal and went to Newport, Rhode Island, and that became a home base in Newport.
Wow.
And I got off of that ship in Newport and got on a ship called the Arcadia, USS Arcadia. And I stayed on that ship for the rest of the 4 years that I was in the Navy.
And you came back to Nashville
Right.
in the early 50s, correct, or mid-50s?
Well, I went in the Navy on January 1st, 1954, I believe it was. I met my wife, Rita, while I was in Newport, and we got married 6 days after I got out of the Navy, came to Nashville. You know, I really didn't know what I was going to do. Here I was married and didn't have a place to live, and just didn't have anything. We moved in with my mother for a while. Then, luckily, I got a job at the newspaper. And the strange thing about that is I got a call from someone who said, why don't you go down newspaper and see Paul Page? He's a state editor, and he needs a reporter. And I said, hey, I'm not a reporter. Just go see Paul Page. Well, I went down to see Paul, and the first thing he said was, can you type? And I said, yeah, I learned how to type in the Navy. He said, well, you're hired. So I wrote obituaries, and for 4 months I wrote obituaries, and they got called into the front office, and they promoted me to police reporter. Tell you, when I first started, I didn't know where the police station was. My boss, Charlie Moss, said, just go downtown, that area down there, you'll run into it. Well, there was an old brick building, not a brick building, an old limestone building on 2nd Avenue. And it had, the court was still there, the city court was there. And they had an opening in the middle of it where the paddy wagon could drive in and let the prisoner out, and they could walk him right on into the booking room. But I'd go in there early in the morning, and the detectives, before they go on duty, they sit there and play cards. And I'd sit around and watch them. Well, before too long, if there's an opening, they'd say, hey, Larry, come on, play. Well, this is before, it's early before I would go to work. So I'd sit down to play, and you'd be surprised how many stories I'd get just sitting there with them. And I think that's why I became known to everybody in the police department so well. But I stayed on a police reporting job for about 12, 13 years. Really enjoyed it and did very well. I stayed at the Banner until 1979. And that's when John Jay and Brownlee Curry and somebody else bought the Banner. And I knew John Jay. I'd known him.
Talking about John J. Hooker.
Yeah, John J. Hook, I'm sorry. And I knew it wasn't going to be for me because I did a lot of investigative reporting and closed a lot of places, and particular charities and the Boy Scouts, United Cerebral Palsy, and some other things. And I felt that if I got into something that John Jay had an interest in somehow, he'd kill the story. I just felt that. And I just said, I've got to move on. One morning, it had been about a week, I went up in his front office, and he said, we're going to build fireplaces in our offices. And I said, who? And he told me, he and his partners. And John Jay's office was about 10 by 10. And I didn't know how he was going to put a fireplace in there. And I said, come on back to the newsroom, I want to show you something. I said, you see those typewriters? They've been here for 15, 20 years. And I said, the desks, they were here when I got here 25 years ago. And he said, well, you people have chosen the way you want to live, and I've chosen the way I want to live. I said, that's good, John Jay. And I immediately got on the phone and called Tom Irvin at Channel 5 and said, I'm leaving. He said, no, you're coming with us. And so I went directly to Channel 5 and stayed there 21 years.
Wow. Yeah.
And I got had some sickness, and I had to retire. And I stayed off two years, I guess. It was depression. I had severe depression. But I got over it in 2 years or so. And Demetria Calademus came out to the house, and she said, you going to go back to work? And I said, yeah, but I'm going to work 3 days a week, I think. Well, it turns out her general manager called, and I went to work over there. And it was the general manager over there was one of the nicest people I ever worked for. He died in 3 years, and as you know, things go down when the new management comes in. And I stayed a couple more years, and I'd had enough, and so I quit and started writing for the Nashville Retrospect.
Larry's relationship with law enforcement was so close, he got calls at his home from police dispatchers with tips. He was often one of the first to show up at crime scenes and was sometimes mistaken for a police detective. And when Opry star David Stringbean Aikman and his wife were murdered, one detective even allowed Larry to hide evidence, just long enough for Larry to get the scoop on the story. But this close relationship with officers of the law didn't necessarily stop him from turning the light on them.
Policemen are, for the most part, a different breed. They're good people. Some of them, they're real rough, but you can't believe how much good they do. Some of them do some bad. There was graft. I knew there was graft. I couldn't prove it. I knew it, but I know our mayors knew there was graft. And I'm sure that they were involved in a little graft. But I know 3 or 4 of them went to prison for graft. But then some of our sheriffs went to prison for graft.
Now, that was a story that you helped expose, right?
Yeah.
The use of inmates for personal...
Yeah, Faye Thomas. Now, everybody knew Faye Thomas was on the take, everybody. But nobody cared. That was Faye Thomas. That was part of his makeup. And Fate moved out of Highway 70 in an apartment complex. But he and Mickey, his wife, it wasn't big enough for them. So every morning he'd have prisoners come out, and they dug a room beneath his apartment. Apartment, I guess it is, a condo. And when he got through, they had a big room for card games. And you just got to know Fate. I know when he finally got out of prison, I flew to some city, and I've been trying to think where it was. I can't remember, but he got out of a prison in Texas, and he flew to wherever I was, and I rode back to Nashville with him, sat with him on the plane. And a friend of mine over Channel 4 said, I thought I had that story all to myself. I thought this was going to be great. He said, I'd like to die when you got off the plane with him.
Well, another thing I wanted to ask you about was the courthouse. You wrote a story for us once just about various things you remember happening at the courthouse.
Yeah, there were. There was a court trial going on, and I don't remember who the defendant was, but the lawyers in the case were Dale Quillen and Bill Willis. And I don't know what happened between the two, but when they had a recess for lunch, they all called a elevator from the 6th floor down to the ground floor. And Quillen and Willis got into a fight in the elevator. I think Quillen was about twice the size of Bill Willis. I think Bill was pretty well puffed up, maybe even a black eye when he got down to the 1st floor. There was a shooting outside Judge Leather's criminal court. One bondsman had shot another bondsman. And I was just right down, next floor down, and somebody ran in and told me, and I jumped up, and the bondsman, the one that did the shooting, I think was named Waddy, they were all still up there, and the victim was still laying on the floor outside the courthouse. Just so many things. There was one of the funniest things was this woman walked into the ground floor of the courthouse and walked up to Mary Farrell's office, and she was the election coordinator. And she was really mad. She was just upset, said she couldn't believe that she came in to vote, and they had sent her down the hall, and down the hall was Dr. Lentz, the county doctor. And she said, I couldn't believe it. I got a shot, and I had to stick my tongue out, and they checked all that, and all I wanted to do was vote. Of course, she didn't know that she'd gotten to the wrong office. There was just a lot of things. There's always something.
Larry covered quite a few city administrations under different mayors, such as Ben West and Richard Fulton. One of the early ones was Beverly Briley, the grandfather of Mayor David Briley, and the first mayor of the metropolitan government, which started in 1963.
He had a notion to take a drink once in a while, quite often. And he drove a city car. It was a big, long car. It was dark maroon. And occasionally he had wrecks. But they had a second big, long car, colored the same, identical color, parked in the police station garage. And as soon as the mayor had a wreck, they'd whistle and hurry up and get that other car out, put his wrecked car in the basement till they could move it on out.
Wow, he had them that frequently.
Yeah. But he was smart. He ran a good office. City progressed quite heavy with him.
So I wanted to ask you, I'm having been doing this for a few years now and going through the Banner archives, I see a lot of the photographers' names like Jack Gunter and Bill Goodman and Don Foster and Owen Cartwright.
Yeah.
You knew these guys and worked with them. How would that work? Would you if you went out on a story, would you just point to someone and say, hey, come with me? Or did they find the stories and they said, hey, Larry, come on, we got a story?
No, they never found the story. I would call them. Generally, Jack Gunner went on a lot of stories with me, and I'd call Jack at home and say, hey, Jack, so-and-so, pick me up, or I'll meet you at the address or whatever. Bill Goodman went on a few. Owen Cartwright was one of the newer photographers, and he didn't go on many. Jack ended up going on most of them, like the string bean case. Jack went out on that case. But he went on a lot of cases with me, but no, nobody would give me the stories. I never.
Well, tell me how that happened. Like, I know obviously you get calls from the police, you get the dispatcher, you get some tips that way. I know you've had people come to you and say, hey, there's something going on here. But when that wasn't happening, what did you do to find stories?
Oh, I'd be at the courthouse. I'd be at the police station. I'd just go around seeing what's going on and so on.
When you were doing the stories, did you take handwritten notes? Did you ever record interviews? How did you do it?
Well, I could remember a lot of it. I'd take notes for the newspaper, but 20, 30 years later, I would have lost those notes, and I'd go to the newspaper, and then I could look at the story and remember things. It's kind of like Red O'Donnell was a columnist at the Nashville Banner, and he wrote a front page column. It was kind of funny, kind of a column.
When it round the clock, was it?
Yeah, around the clock. And one day he had a story, a little interview with this guy, and this fellow never talked to the news media. And I said, Red, did that guy actually tell you that? He said, well, Larry, no, he didn't, but he would have if I'd asked him. Red was great.
And were you expected to turn something in constantly?
No, they didn't have to worry. I did. I had enough stories to keep going, but once in a while you just run dead, and you don't have any stories. But if you notice the Banner, I did many front page stories.
Yes, you did.
And I think that's why when I decided to leave the Banner, I just made one phone call and was given a job at Channel 5. You hear people say, I liked work so much I'd go in early. Well, that was me. I loved work. And there's no such thing as overtime pay. I was making I was making $75 a week when I went to the police department. But I enjoyed it. I just really enjoyed working. And I didn't like television near as much as I liked newspaper. Love the newspaper work. television, you've got to be involved. You go on a story, and you got a photographer, and you got an editor, and you got this, and you got that. And newspaper, it's just you. You're out there.
Police reporting is not only about crime, of course. Larry covered his fair share of accidents and disasters, too. On March 5th, 1963, country music star Patsy Cline boarded a small airplane bound for Nashville with fellow performers Cowboy Copas and Hawkshaw Hawkins. They encountered severe weather on the way and crashed 90 miles from Nashville in Camden, Tennessee.
I got a call somewhere around 11 o'clock, I guess, at night about a plane missing. I thought it had crashed in Camden. And I called a photographer, and I got in my car and headed to Camden. And it was still dark. And we had to sit in the car, wait till it get a little light. And then when it did get light, there was 2 state troopers, myself, walked into this wooded area. And the plane was there. And the pilot, who shouldn't have been flying, the plane got turned upside down or something and plowed straight into the ground, and there wasn't much left of anybody. It was just nothing. And they just put all the bodies in one bag and took it to the funeral home, and they separated parts of the body there.
In our upcoming September 2019 issue, you'll be able to read about the official opening of the Maxwell House Hotel 150 years ago, in September 1869. Construction of the hotel had been interrupted by the Civil War, during which time it was used by the Federal Army as a prison, hospital, and barracks. The building not only gave its name to the famous coffee brand, it was a Nashville institution for over 100 years, hosting everything from early Ku Klux Klan meetings to school dances in the big band era. That ended in 1961.
I got a call on Christmas that there seemed to be some kind of fire at the Maxwell House Hotel. And so I drove and called a photographer and got a photographer there, and I drove down and stayed. Well, it finally snuffed itself out the next day, on day after Christmas. I remember standing outside looking way up to the top, and John Ragsdale was the chief of the fire department. And all of a sudden, just one little whiff of smoke coming out of one of the top floors. And I said, well, Chief, looks like you've got it beaten down now. Y'all are home free. And he said, no, Larry. He said, we're going to lose this whole building. I said, what do you mean? He said, the fire is in between floors. We can't save it. And, of course, it burned down. Burned up, whichever way you want it.
Larry covered a lot of killings in Nashville, some of them by the state of Tennessee. Since the state prison and its death row were located here, Larry was expected to report on executions, whether he liked it or not.
The warden, who was Lynn Boma, was an All-American football player at Vanderbilt. And I don't know why, because I'd only been on the newspaper a while, he began calling me at home. Now, he sounded a little tipsy. You know, I could tell that he'd been having a few drinks. But they were going to execute, and then he wanted me to come out, get out there about 5 o'clock in the morning for the execution. Well, the next morning I was there at 5 o'clock and went in his office, and he said, sit down and read this brochure of the man we're going to execute this morning. And well, he came back and he said, okay, let's go. And I said, go where? We're going to go execute him. Yeah, why do you want me? You're going to watch it. I said, I'm not going to watch you execute somebody. That's not in my job. If y'all want to execute him, y'all go ahead and do it, and I'll meet you in the guards' dining room when you get through. Well, it wasn't hardly 30 minutes later. The warden and deputy warden and some of his people came in there and sat down, and, you know, they had just put a man in the electric chair. And they were eating bacon and eggs and grits and all of this food. I don't know how in the world they could eat after seeing something like that. Just unbelievable. I never would watch it. And I would go out. There was 2 more that same year, and I went out but I never would watch it. These days, when they execute someone, they send out a notice to all the news media asking for anybody who wanted to witness the execution to file their name with the warden. And I couldn't imagine all these reporters, most of them young, signed up to go watch it. How or why, I'll never know. That just wasn't something I wanted to do, and they didn't pay me to do it, and even if they had, I wouldn't have done it. The last execution I had anything to do with was in Shelbyville. A ex-serviceman upset over his wife getting a divorce, and she got custody of the 3 sons. It was around Christmas time, and he wanted to take them and buy them Christmas gifts. So he got them to come to Shelbyville from where she was living. They were living with her. And he took them to Walmart and bought them gifts, then took them to McDonald's and fed them, and took them back to this garage. He was a mechanic, and he had this garage, and he had a big tarpaulin shutting off part of the garage to where he was working. And one by one, he got his sons, and she had a daughter, a little young daughter, and the sons were all young. One by one, he'd got them to come on his side of the tarpaulin, and he'd shoot them in the head and kill them. He killed all 4 of them. Well, I interviewed him about that up there. As nice a fellow as you could meet, he just wasn't going to have his ex-wife and his children living with her. So he eventually got convicted and went to prison. He got convicted, of course, went to prison in death row. And I interviewed him again in death row. And it was really strange. He wanted to die. He knew what he had done was wrong. And he wanted to be put to death in the worst way they could put him to death. Now, they could either execute him or they could kill him with pills or some poison. And he chose execution by electric chair. And I often think about him. I had never heard an inmate wanting to die that way. But I tell you, I'd rather be executed than live in the death row. It's a horrible place. It is. It's terrible.
Another big story Larry covered was the murder of Janet March, who was first reported missing on August 29, 1996, by her mother and by her husband, Perry March. He claimed that 2 weeks earlier she had left for a 12-day vacation. No one has seen her since. Even though her body was never located, Perry March was convicted of her murder in August 2006.
I called him, wanted to do an interview early on, real early. I think it had been 1 or 2 interviews done, and I didn't think he was going to give me one, but he said, yeah. So I met him here in Nashville and did an interview, and did another one in Chattanooga and some more in Nashville. I was convinced, wasn't in doubt in my mind that he had killed her, wasn't a doubt. He went to Mexico and took his 2 kids, and I went to Mexico twice doing interviews with him and with the children. Well, the oldest son was about 10, I guess, so. And I asked the oldest son, I said, tell me about that night. And he said, well, I was sent to bed because it was time for me to go to bed. And my mother came up, and she was carrying a little satchel of some sort and said she was going on a vacation, and she'd be back in a few days. And she left and went down into the garage to the car. And as she drove out the driveway, she stopped and turned and waved goodbye to me, and I was standing in the window waving back to her. I thought, well, heck, that's a hell of a story. I mean, we've written all these bad stories about March. This is kind of a different side of the story, and he deserves, whether it's true or not, he deserves. Well, I was with Channel 5, and they wouldn't run the story. Apparently, some of the female news people there thought it called a child psychologist, and the child psychologist told them, "Don't run the story. It's a bad story." So they didn't run the story. It upset me because I thought he deserved it, even though I didn't think. I thought it, that his father had probably told him that story so many times that it's part of his life now. Anyway, they never ran the story. Later on, one of the reporters down at Channel 5, back when they went to trial, took the tape with my interview and put himself as being in Mexico, and as if he was me, and he acted like me, and they ran the interview. But I became close to him. I knew in my mind he did it, but her father would not talk to the news media. He talked to me, but he wouldn't talk about the case at all. And I didn't figure it was really right to have their version on the story without having his version. So he decided he was just going to let me do the interviews from then on. It was fine. So for 5 years, he didn't interview anybody but me. And as I say, I interviewed him in Chicago and all these different places he'd be. But at the end, after they had brought him back from Mexico, I went over to the jail. And by then, I had gone to work at Channel 4. I'd come back from sickness, and instead of going back to Channel 5, they offered me a job, but I just wanted to go to 4, which is near my home. So I went over there, and I called him, and he said, "Larry, I don't like Channel 4. And I said, "Well, Perry, I'm sorry, but I'm working at Channel 4 now." "Well, I don't like them. They did a bad story on me, and I don't like them." And I said, "Well, I'm sorry, Perry. We'll just end it here then." Later on, I went over to the jail and talked to him very briefly, very kind of distant talk. And I never had anything much to do with him. I didn't have anything to do with him after that. I didn't cover the trial or anything. Nick Barris and I had a morning show on Channel 5. It came on at 7 till 9, I think it was, something like that, 7 to 8:30. This was early on. This was before we separated. Perry and I separated. And he would come on all the time. And he loved publicity.
He would call in?
He would call in all the time. He loved publicity. And we'd interview him a couple times a week about things. Finally, though, after I gave up with him and decided I wasn't going to be with him anymore, Nick called him. He was in prison somewhere in East Tennessee, Perry was, and Nick called him, and Perry agreed to do an interview with him. So Nick and a photographer headed for somewhere in East Tennessee, way away. And when he got about halfway there, Perry called him and told him that he wasn't going to do the interview. Well, Nick talked him into doing it. And when he got to the prison, they got into a little room, and he and Perry by themselves and the photographer. And the first question, Nick said, "Did you kill Miss March?" And Perry looked at me now and stood up and walked out and said, "That's it." Turned around and walked out. And he had not done anything since then. Not a doubt in my mind that he did it.
Larry mentioned to me some of the famous and infamous people he had met in his career, from President Jimmy Carter to James Earl Ray, the convicted killer of Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. But one encounter came up a couple of times in our interview. In May 1963, President John F. Kennedy visited Nashville.
Somebody tipped me that he was going to be staying at the Hermitage Hotel. He was on the third floor, had a suite. So I went to the third floor, and I kept looking for Secret Service agents, but I didn't see any. But there were policemen. There were two policemen on each side of his door on the third floor. And one of them gave me the nod, like, "Do you want to come in?" And, of course, I said, "Yes, sure, I want to come in." Well, I went in, and there was a governor. The room was full of people. All of the Kennedy clan was there. Various politicians were there. And for 10 minutes, I looked around trying to find Mr. Kennedy. And I couldn't find him, but there was a door over on the right of the room, a fairly large room. And so I said, well, what the heck? So I went into the door, and there he was sitting no more than 3 or 4 feet from the door on the edge of the bed, dressed in his underclothes. His undershorts were striped, bright colors, and he was eating a bowl of soup, getting ready to take a shower. And his valet I heard the valet say, you can have your shower now. And I'm standing there in front of him, and it felt like I was there for 2 hours, but it was just for almost no time at all. And I looked at him, and he looked at me, and I didn't know what to say. Here I am right next to the president. Finally, I just stuck my pad out and said, can I have your autograph? That's all I could think. I mean, here, the war was going on and everything. And so I got his autograph and finally gave it to my son.
But no interview, huh?
No, I didn't ask him a question. Just said, thank you.
Larry's reporting got him into trouble more than a few times, even with his own editor, which you can hear about in episode 1. His dogged investigation of corruption and his determination to get the story right and get it first has left a lasting mark on Nashville's history. But not everyone liked Larry for his work, particularly the people who ended up fired or in jail. I asked him about the enemies he's made along the way.
Made some. One called me. I was doing some team stories, and teams were going around throwing rocks and other things through barbershop windows. They were trying to intimidate barbers to join the union. And this one man called me, who I knew, and he said, well, I'm coming by your house. You're not going to do this. I said, okay, come on. So he came by and sat down, and we talked about 15 minutes, and he got up and left. You can't let them intimidate you. If you do that, then you shouldn't be a reporter. You just got to tell it like it is and be there to talk to people who want to talk to you. But I still get stopped on the street and places that people remember me, and I hope they remember me for being honest and straightforward and telling it like it is.
Another case in which Larry Brinton made some enemies began in the mid-1970s. It was a government scandal so huge it made national headlines. Eventually, a book was written about it, and a movie was made based on the book. It all started in September 1976 when Larry was contacted by a woman named Marie Rejanti.
Marie was a lawyer in Nashville, and she got a job as the head of the Tennessee Parole Board, chairman of the Tennessee Parole Board. And one day she called me at the office, says, can you meet with me? And you know me, I'm all, yeah, sure. Because anybody like that calls me, I'm ready. And I met with her at Deep Wells picnic grounds at Percy Warner Park. And she's telling me this story, how some members of the state parole board were selling paroles, that the governor was involved and his legal his lawyer was involved in it, and several members of the parole board. I wrote a story on it that led to the eventual FBI investigation and the arrest of the governor. Now, he was not charged with selling paroles. He was charged with selling liquor licenses. His lawyer was involved in the parole business, and several other high state officials were charged, and the governor and his lawyer and a couple of other members of the parole board went to prison for that.
And you got quite a bit of attention nationally for that, didn't you?
Yeah, well, the idea is to get it first, get it right and get it first. And that's what I tried to do, and that's what I did.
And what I also was, now that was known as the Cash-for-Clemency scandal.
Cash-for-Clemency,
right?
even though the governor didn't sell the parole himself. Although he did allow a number of inmates to get released from prison. Kind of a Christmas bonus, but there was 70-some-odd inmates that he turned out. As a matter of fact, we just did a story last month, the month before last,
That's right,
on one of them.
Larry wrote about his involvement in the Cash-for-Clemency case in our September 2011 issue. A 1983 book about the scandal was titled Marie, A True Story, and was written by Peter Moss. It details how Rajanti was hired by the Blanton administration, then pressured to rubber stamp questionable paroles that had been paid for, which she refused to do despite threats and intimidation. For blowing the whistle, Rajanti was fired by Governor Blanton based on trumped-up charges. She sued the state, won her case, and got her job back, but not before a close friend and co-worker, who was slated to appear as a witness on her behalf, was found murdered in a hotel room. The success of the book documenting this political intrigue led to a movie by the same name, released in 1985. A Warner Archives Collection DVD is available at Amazon.com, and I recommend it. It's not only a decent thriller and courtroom drama, it's also an interesting record of Nashville in the early 1980s. Many scenes were filmed on location here, so you can see the old airport, the state capitol, the Metro Courthouse, and other spots around the city. One scene was filmed on Broadway at night. Rajanti, played by Sissy Spacek, is pulled over by a Metro motorcycle cop and arrested for drunk driving. That's when she decides to hire an attorney, who is played by actor Fred Thompson. Only he wasn't really an actor at the time. He was Rajanti's actual attorney. He got more acting jobs later, and eventually became a U.S. Senator. Other actors include Jeff Daniels and Morgan Freeman. And, of course, Larry Brinton, who, like Thompson, portrayed himself. Larry appears in a number of the press scenes, but he only speaks in one. Imagine Sissy as Marie coming out of the old Tennessee State Prison. She is met by a gaggle of reporters jamming microphones and TV cameras in her face. Larry is the first reporter you hear clearly, asking about liquor licenses, and he's the last reporter you hear, asking about the FBI.
There she is. Can we have a few words, please? Working at a liquor store that Blanton got for Jim Allen, his campaign manager.
I only know Mr. Edwards doesn't meet the board's published guidelines for a pardon.
On his job application, Edwards says he already had the governor's pardon.
Well, perhaps he was just being optimistic.
There are rumors that pardons and paroles can be bought. Is that the basis for your conflict with the other members of the board?
I haven't heard any rumors, and I'm not aware of any conflict with the board. You'll have to talk to the other members.
Just how did you get the governor to give you your job? There's Strauber over here. You know, I heard you'd gone to the FBI.
Who told you that?
Oh, it's around. I wish you luck, Marie, but I'd be careful if I was you.
Part of that scene is used in the trailer for the movie, which you can watch online at youtube.com and listen to at the end of this podcast. Larry is featured prominently in the trailer, particularly when he's caught in a freeze frame for the title of the movie.
Well, because Marie, that was the name of the movie, and Marie was going to kind of, I guess, pay me back for doing all the work on the story.
In an interesting side note, even the filming of the movie wasn't without intrigue. While Sissy Spacek was staying at the Hermitage Hotel, someone got into her locked room and stole 2 scripts. The culprit turned out to be someone who had been an outspoken critic of the book. Marie Rajanti was reportedly shocked and appalled, but she probably wasn't too surprised, given her experiences during the Cash-for-Clemency scandal.
I talked to her once in a while. She's scared to come back to Nashville. She made lots of enemies by giving me that story. And I know once she's been back, and I interviewed her, but she's still scared to come back to Nashville because of what might happen to her.
I imagine that Marie Rajanti, like me, feels lucky that Larry Brinton learned how to type in the Navy and got a job writing obituaries at the Nashville Banner. I'm certainly fortunate to have known and worked with him, if only for a short time. Hopefully, investigative journalists like Larry are not a vanishing breed. They might be, though, if we don't take the time to remember the ones who made a difference.
It's the most interesting job that a person can have. I don't know how or why I was so lucky in my life. Never once thought that I'd end up. So, I mean, here's a fellow that didn't have enough money to go to college, worked all his life. And next thing you know, I'm sitting at a little table with Billy Graham. I mean, I just met with so many people that I thought I'd never get within 100 miles of these people. And here I am talking to them. But that's life, and you have to have a lot of luck. I had a lot. I had more than I deserve, I guess. But if you decide what you want to get into it 100%. Don't hold back on anything and just enjoy life.
Thank you, Larry, very much for talking to us.
Good. Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Nashville Retrospect. For more information about the stories you heard, including photographs, see the show notes on the podcast webpage, which you can find a link to at nashvilleretrospect.com. You can also email your comments and suggestions to nashretroshow@gmail.com. This show was written and produced by me, Allen Forkum. Stay tuned for the next one, and in the meantime, don't forget to pick up your copy of the Nashville Retrospect.
Evil flourishes when good men do nothing.
Criminals went free.
What are you all wasting my time for? I'll be out tomorrow.
Officials were bribed.
There are rumors that pardons can be bought.
Witnesses were threatened. The FBI couldn't stop it.
They're talking about dropping the investigation.
But one woman had the courage to try.
You are a troublemaker.
That is a lie.
Larkin Bibbs, second-degree murder. Christmas clemency, Clayton Dawson. Death penalty, commuted to life.
And we want a hearing scheduled right quick. That boy's daddy was a big contributor.
He told me this clemency would be successful if I gave him $20,000.
That's extortion.
No money has changed hands.
You're never gonna get away with this.
Now, who the hell started this?
Well, I think it's Marie. It's your mouth I'm talking about.
If I were you, I'd spend more time thinking about the future.
I will not resign.
Do you think we're in danger, Fred?
Marie, they're gonna smear you with everything they can.
Somebody has to stand up to them, Fred.
In 1978, in the state of Tennessee, the criminal justice system was put on trial. It placed the power of the government against the word of one woman. Marie. Sissy Spacek, in an explosive true story.